In 1985 and 1986, Kramer Guitars outsold every guitar maker in America. Fender, Gibson, all of them, from a single assembly plant on Neptune Boulevard in Neptune, New Jersey. They made the superstrats that defined hair metal, pointy headstocks, Floyd Rose tremolos, custom graphics, Eddie Van Halen's name behind every unit that left the building. Then, piece by piece, the structure gave way. A factory that had stopped making its own parts and couldn't survive when the overseas shipments stalled. Endorsement deals that cost more than a cooling market could sustain. Royalties unpaid until the hardware maker walked and handed the contract to Fender. By 1991, the original company was finished. What was left went out in a fire sale. Surplus necks, unfinished bodies, bins of hardware, sold to whoever showed up. The building is still there. It houses healthcare offices now. This is the story of how a music store owner named Dennis Berardi built the fastest guitar empire in American history out of a New Jersey factory, and how a company that learned to sell the 1980s faster than anyone else never built a structure that could outlast them. Not through one disaster, through a sequence of reasonable choices, each one hollowing out what the last one had built. There's a stretch of Neptune Boulevard in Neptune, New Jersey, where the buildings sit low and quiet against a flat commercial skyline. Healthcare offices, business suites, the kind of addresses you drive past without slowing down. Nothing about the place announces that it mattered. Nothing suggests that for a few years in the mid-1980s, a factory on this road was the loudest address in American popular music. Not a recording studio, not a concert hall, a guitar factory, a compact New Jersey assembly plant where striped paint dried under heat lamps, Floyd Rose tremolos were bolted to basswood bodies, and instruments built for speed and volume shipped out the back door to the biggest names in hard rock. Kramer Guitars didn't just sell instruments during the hair metal boom. For 2 consecutive years, 1985 and 1986, they outsold Fender. They outsold Gibson. They were, by the numbers, the best-selling guitar brand in America, operating out of a building most people in the state didn't know existed. The man who ran that building was named Dennis Berardi. He wasn't a luthier by training. He was a music store owner from New Jersey who understood something most instrument makers didn't. That selling guitars to rock stars wasn't about wood selection or tone woods or tradition. It was about being in the room when the right phone rang, about saying yes faster than anyone else, about making the guitar that looked like it belonged on MTV before MTV knew what it wanted. And for a while, it worked better than anyone could have predicted. Kramer didn't crawl toward success. It detonated. A startup founded in the late 1970s became the dominant brand in American electric guitar by the middle of the next decade, fueled by one endorsement that changed everything, one piece of hardware that no competitor could match, and a willingness to spend money as if the party had no closing time. But here's what the billboards and the magazine ads and the artist endorsements couldn't show you. By 1987, the guitars stamped American Series and assembled in Neptune were built almost entirely from Japanese-made necks and bodies. The factory that symbolized American rock excess was already, quietly, an assembly hub dependent on parts made 6,000 miles away. The seeds of collapse weren't hiding in the decline. They were baked into the peak. The story begins not with Eddie Van Halen, not with the Floyd Rose tremolo, not with the pointy headstock that became the visual shorthand for an entire genre. It begins with 2 men who thought aluminum could change the guitar. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. In the late 1970s, the electric guitar wasn't looking for a revolution. Fender and Gibson owned the market the way Ford and GM owned the highway, through sheer institutional mass, brand loyalty, and decades of accumulated credibility. Breaking into that duopoly required either deep pockets or a genuinely different idea. Gary Kramer had the idea. He'd come out of the orbit of Travis Bean, the California luthier who'd built a small cult following with aluminum neck guitars in the mid-1970s. Bean's instruments were striking, bright, sustain-rich, visually unlike anything in a guitar shop, but they had problems. The necks were cold to the touch. The guitars were heavy. Players respected them more than they loved them. Kramer believed he could fix what Bean had started. Keep the aluminum, I'll lose the discomfort. His design concept used aluminum necks reinforced with wooden inserts, walnut, maple, that softened the feel, reduced the weight, and let the instrument look futuristic without punishing the player's fretting hand. It was a smart idea. It was also not enough to build a company. For that, Kramer needed partners. Dennis Berardi brought the retail instinct. He'd been running a music store in New Jersey, and he understood something that most luthiers missed. Guitars were sold in shops by salespeople to kids who wanted to sound like someone they'd seen on a stage. The instrument had to work, yes, but it also had to sell. Peter LaPlaca carried the corporate experience. He'd worked at Norlin, the conglomerate that owned Gibson during its widely criticized 1970s period, and he knew what large-scale instrument distribution looked like. The logistics, the dealer networks, the margins. Henry Vaccaro supplied the investment capital that turned a concept into a company. And Philip J. Patillo, a New Jersey luthier, built the early prototypes that proved the aluminum insert design could actually function as a production instrument rather than a one-off experiment. 4 men, a retail operator, a namesake designer, a corporate veteran, and an investor. That's not the origin story the hair metal mythology would later suggest. There was no garage-born genius, no single visionary bending metal at midnight. This was a commercial venture assembled by people who wanted to manufacture and sell guitars at scale. The romance came later. The early Kramers were beautiful in a severe, almost architectural way. Ebonol fingerboards, a synthetic material, smooth and dark, sat atop those aluminum and wood necks. Schaller hardware from Germany gave the instruments a European precision. The body woods were chosen for visual impact as much as tone. Koa, walnut, figured maple. These weren't cheap guitars. They weren't trying to undercut Fender on price. They were trying to out-future Fender on feel, look, and sustain. And for a niche market, it worked. The aluminum neck Kramers found players who wanted something different, something that looked like it had been designed in the same decade they were living in. The instruments earned respect in guitar magazines. They got noticed. They did not, however, sell in the numbers that would keep 4 partners and a growing payroll comfortable. The problem was fundamental. Aluminum necks were expensive to produce. They required specialized tooling that wooden necks didn't. They limited the company's ability to scale, because every additional unit carried a higher materials cost than a conventional guitar. And while the design solved some of Travis Bean's comfort issues, it didn't solve all of them. Some players still found the instruments heavier than they wanted, still found the neck feel unfamiliar. Kramer had built a better mousetrap. The market wanted a louder one. By the turn of the decade, it was becoming clear inside the Neptune operation that the aluminum dream, as a mass market proposition, had a ceiling. The guitars were good. The concept was clever. But cleverness doesn't fill a factory. What fills a factory is volume. Island volume meant making the same concession that nearly every American instrument company eventually confronts: the choice between purity of vision and the economics of scale. Something had to give. What gave was the aluminum. In 1981, Kramer made the decision that would define everything that followed. They pivoted away from aluminum necks and toward conventional wooden neck instruments. On paper, it looked like surrender. The company's founding idea, abandoned. In practice, it was survival. Wooden necks were cheaper to produce, easier to source, more familiar to the vast majority of guitar players, and far simpler to manufacture at volume. The aluminum experiment had proved the company could innovate. The wooden pivot proved it could read a market, but the pivot didn't stop at materials. It extended to geography. Late in 1981, Kramer began sourcing necks and hardware from manufacturers in Japan. The arrangement was straightforward and, at the time, entirely rational. Japanese factories could produce wooden guitar components at a quality and cost point that Neptune couldn't match. The necks and bodies would ship across the Pacific to New Jersey, where Kramer's own workers would handle fretting, assembly, finishing, and final setup. The guitar that left the building would say Kramer. The hands that shaped most of its wood would be Japanese. This was not unusual. By the early 1980s, offshore component sourcing was becoming standard across the American instrument industry. What made it consequential for Kramer was the degree to which the company would eventually lean on it. and how fast that lean would accelerate once success arrived. In 1981, the Japanese supply line was a pragmatic supplement. Within 6 years, it would become the entire structural foundation. But in the early going, the hybrid model felt like the best of both worlds. Neptune kept its identity as the place where Kramers became Kramers, where raw components were transformed into finished, branded, setup-ready instruments. The spray booths still hummed, the soldering stations stayed busy, neck pockets were fitted, frets were dressed, electronics were wired and tested. If you'd walked the floor in 1982, you'd have seen workers building guitars, and you wouldn't have been wrong. You'd just have been seeing the last stage of a process that now started in a different country. The product line was changing too. The old Fender-inspired headstock shape gave way to a new design, the distinctive beak headstock that would become one of Kramer's visual signatures. Rockinger tremolos from Germany, designed by Dieter Gulsdorf, appeared on the instruments, giving players a vibrato system that could handle aggressive pitch manipulation. The guitars were getting pointier, faster looking, more aggressive in silhouette. They were starting to look like what the 1980s would soon demand, and Neptune was becoming something new. Not a pure manufacturing facility, not in the way it had been when aluminum blanks were machined on site. It was now a hybrid operation. Part assembly plant, part finishing shop, part brand laboratory. Design decisions were made here. Color choices, pickup configurations, bridge placements, neck profiles, all of that was Neptune's domain. The creative identity of the instrument lived in New Jersey, even as the physical components increasingly did not. It was the first bargain with scale, and like most first bargains, it felt painless. The guitars were better, the costs were lower, the product line was broader, the dealers were happier. Nobody in 1982 was losing sleep over what might happen if the Japanese supply chain hiccuped, because in 1982 the supply chain was working fine. What nobody could see yet was that this arrangement had a structural weakness hidden inside its efficiency. The more Neptune relied on offshore components, the less it could do if those components stopped arriving on time. The factory's power was shifting, from the ability to make things to the ability to assemble and brand things. That distinction didn't matter when everything flowed smoothly. It would matter enormously when it didn't. But that reckoning was years away. In 1982, the reckoning that arrived was much better news. It arrived as the best things in the American music industry often do, by accident, on a plane to California. In early 1982, Dennis Berardi boarded a flight to Anaheim. Somewhere between the East Coast and the West, he found himself talking to a man who managed the road operations for one of the biggest rock bands in the world. By the time the plane landed, Berardi had a meeting set up, not with the manager, with the guitarist. Eddie Van Halen, in 1982, was the most influential electric guitar player alive. His right-hand tapping technique had rewritten what the instrument could do. His tone, that searing, harmonically rich, slightly unhinged sound, was the thing every young guitarist in America was trying to replicate. And his relationship with his guitars was famously restless. He modified everything. He sawed bodies apart. He repainted them. He swapped parts. He was, in the most literal sense, looking for something that didn't exist yet. Dennis Berardi walked into that meeting and offered to build it. What followed wasn't a polished corporate endorsement deal negotiated through layers of management. It was closer to a handshake between a salesman who understood urgency and a musician who wanted a guitar yesterday. Berardi grasped something that Fender and Gibson, with their institutional caution, were slower to act on. Eddie Van Halen's approval wasn't just marketing. It was a command signal to every guitar store in America. If Eddie played it, kids would buy it. Paul Unkert was the man who had to make it real. Unkert worked in the Kramer shop as the principal luthier, the builder whose hands translated Eddie's restless demands into actual instruments. He handled design details, construction, and the delicate artist relations work of keeping a famously particular musician happy. The job was part craftsmanship, part diplomacy, part emergency response. There's a story, recounted by Paul Reed Smith, of a frantic phone call from Berardi. Eddie was coming, a guitar needed to be ready, and the Neptune shop had to pull it together on a timeline that had more to do with a rock star's schedule than a production calendar. That kind of last-minute hot rod energy wasn't a failure of process. It was the process. Kramer, at its best, operated like a custom shop running at factory speed. By 1983, the partnership had produced a weapon. Kramer began offering original Floyd Rose tremolos as standard equipment, not as an aftermarket add-on, not as a dealer-installed option, but as stock hardware on production guitars. The Floyd Rose was the tremolo system that every shredder in America wanted. It locked the strings at both the nut and the bridge, which meant a player could dive bomb the whammy bar, pull it back, and the guitar would still be in tune. No other major manufacturer was offering it stock. Kramer had it. That single hardware decision, stock Floyd Rose, created a competitive moat that no rival could easily cross. Now imagine what Neptune looked like in 1983 and 1984. Japanese-made necks and bodies arriving in shipping containers. Floyd Rose tremolos waiting in bins. Workers fitting those tremolos into routed cavities. Wiring Kramer's chosen pickups. Spraying finishes and colors that didn't exist in nature. Setting up each instrument so the Floyd sat level and the action felt fast under the fingers. Then boxing those guitars and shipping them to dealers who couldn't keep them on the wall. The building wasn't just a factory anymore. It was the place where one guitarist's taste was being translated into thousands of identical instruments, each one carrying Eddie Van Halen's implicit endorsement, even if his name wasn't on the headstock. The guitars sold as fast as dealers could stock them. Kramer wasn't chasing the market anymore. It was telling the market what to want. By late 1985, Neptune was operating at a pitch that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. The company had switched to Seymour Duncan pickups, a brand name that carried its own credibility with serious players, and the product line had crystallized into the look that would define an era. The Beretta, a single humbucker, Floyd Rose-equipped machine designed for speed and nothing else. The Pacer and Focus lines, offering the same superstrat DNA at different price points. Pointy headstocks, hot colors, graphics that looked like they'd been airbrushed on the side of a van and somehow made it onto a musical instrument. And when the sales numbers came in, they confirmed what the dealer backlog had been suggesting all year. Kramer was the best-selling guitar brand in America in 1985 and again in 1986, outselling Fender, outselling Gibson. A company that hadn't existed a decade earlier was now moving more guitars than the two most established names in the industry. Dennis Klein was the man behind some of the most recognizable images on those guitars. Working as an outside contractor, Klein created graphic designs, the vivid, often outrageous artwork that turned a Kramer body into a visual statement. The lightning bolts, the splatter patterns, the custom art that made each graphic finish Kramer feel like a piece of the decade painted onto wood. Inside Neptune, employees clear-coated those bodies, sealing the graphics under layers of finish that would survive stage sweat and pick scratches. It was factory work in service of fantasy. The same hands that fitted bridges and dressed frets were also protecting the painted excess that made the brand feel dangerous. The roster of artists carrying Kramers onto stages and into music videos read like the liner notes of the entire hard rock genre. Richie Sambora of Bon Jovi, Mick Mars of Motley Crue, Vivian Campbell, who'd played with Dio and would later join Def Leppard. And above them all, Eddie Van Halen, whose 5150 album with Van Halen went to number 1 in 1986, the same year Kramer held the top sales position. The brand and the genre were feeding each other. Kramer made the guitars that made the sound that sold the records that sold the guitars. In late 1985, Kramer acquired Spector, the Brooklyn-based bass manufacturer known for its NS2 design. Alan Charney, who'd been heading production at Spector, stayed on as the bass line transitioned into the Neptune facility. Now the same building that was assembling the hottest guitars in rock was also absorbing a respected bass operation. Another production stream, another set of dealer relationships, another line of instruments flowing through the same spray booths and assembly stations. Neptune, in those years, was a compact place doing enormous work. Assembly, finishing, artist relations, product design, shipping, all of it running through one building on a boulevard most Americans had never heard of. The factory floor smelled of lacquer and solder flux. The air in the spray booth carried that sharp, sweet chemical bite of fresh finish, drying under heat. Workers moved between stations with the rhythm of people who knew the sequence cold: neck into pocket, bridge into root, strings on, setup, box, ship. The tempo was fast because the demand was relentless. And for a moment, a real moment, not a nostalgic exaggeration, it felt untouchable. The number one guitar brand in America, operating out of a New Jersey assembly plant, endorsed by the most influential guitarist on the planet, armed with the only stock Floyd Rose in the industry, selling a look and a sound that an entire generation of players wanted to own. It couldn't last, not because the guitars were bad, because the structure underneath them was thinner than it looked. Here is what the sales charts showed. In 1985 and 1986, Kramer Guitars was the dominant brand in American electric guitar. Here is what the sales charts didn't show. By 1987, the American series guitars assembled in Neptune were built almost entirely from Japanese manufactured necks and bodies. The factory's role had narrowed to final assembly, finishing, and quality control, the parts that gave the instrument its fundamental character. The neck profile, the body contour, the wood selection were decisions executed overseas and shipped to New Jersey for completion. This is the hinge. The moment of greatest commercial triumph was also the moment of greatest structural exposure. Neptune was still essential. It was where the brand identity was applied, where the Floyd Rose was installed, where the setup work happened that made a Kramer feel like a Kramer under a player's hands. But the ability to make the core instrument from raw wood to playable guitar had migrated. What remained in New Jersey was the last mile. Valuable, yes. Irreplaceable, no. Dennis Berardi and his management team, including Andrew Papicchio on the operations side, were running a company that looked from the outside like an American manufacturing success story. Magazine ads featured the Neptune address. Artist endorsements referenced the New Jersey operation. The brand mythology was built on the idea of a place, a factory where rock and roll guitars were born. Inside that place, the reality was more complicated and more fragile than the mythology allowed. The product line was also broadening in ways that added complexity without adding resilience. Korean-made instruments, the Stryker and Aerostar lines, had entered the portfolio, aimed at budget-conscious players who wanted the Kramer headstock without the Kramer price. These were fully offshore guitars, not assembled in Neptune at all. But they carried the brand name, and they required their own supply chains, their own quality oversight, their own dealer support. The company was stretching across multiple countries, multiple price points, multiple manufacturing relationships, all managed from the same New Jersey office. And still the money flowed. Endorsement deals, advertising buys, the infrastructure of being number one, which costs almost as much as the infrastructure of becoming number one. The company spent like a brand at its peak because it was a brand at its peak. The question nobody seemed to be asking, or if they asked it, nobody acted on the answer, was what would happen if the peak had a backside. That was the summit. The view was extraordinary, and the ground beneath it had already begun to shift. The first crack didn't come from the American market. It didn't come from a competitor. It came from a labor uprising 6,000 miles away, in a country most Kramer customers couldn't have found on a map. In the summer of 1987, South Korea erupted. The June Democratic struggle. Weeks of mass protests demanding free elections and constitutional reform cracked open decades of authoritarian rule and unleashed a wave of industrial action that would reshape the country's economy. Workers who'd spent years building electronics, automobiles, textiles, and musical instruments under suppressed wages and harsh conditions walked off the job. Between July and September, more than 3,000 labor disputes swept through Korean factories. The strikes weren't about guitars. They were about democracy, dignity, and decades of deferred grievances. But the consequences didn't observe industry boundaries. They rippled outward through every supply chain that touched Korean manufacturing, and one of those supply chains ran straight to a guitar company in Neptune, New Jersey. Kramer had Korean-made guitars in its lineup. The Stryker and Aerostar series, budget instruments aimed at younger players and entry-level buyers who wanted the Kramer headstock without the Kramer price, were manufactured entirely in South Korea. When the strikes hit, production stopped. Orders that dealers had already placed went unfilled. Back orders piled up in a cascading sequence that no amount of phone calls from New Jersey could accelerate. And Kramer, which had structured its business around the assumption that overseas parts and finished goods would arrive on schedule, had no domestic fallback. There was no warehouse of surplus Korean guitars sitting in a Jersey warehouse. There was no alternative factory tooled up and ready to run. There was a supply chain, and the supply chain had seized. The Japanese pipeline was under pressure too, not from labor unrest. Japan's manufacturing base remained stable, but from the sheer volume of demand Kramer had built and the logistical complexity of coordinating component shipments across the Pacific into a single assembly point in Neptune. Every delay in one supply stream cascaded into the next. A late shipment of necks meant a backlog of bodies waiting for assembly. A backlog of bodies meant delayed finishing. Delayed finishing meant missed dealer delivery dates. Missed delivery dates meant lost sales. Because a kid standing in a guitar shop in 1987 with birthday money in his pocket wasn't going to wait 6 weeks for a Kramer. He was going to buy whatever was on the wall. And increasingly, what was on the wall was an Ibanez, or a Jackson, or a Charvel, competitors who'd been watching Kramer's dominance and building their own superstrat offerings with their own supply networks. That's the thing about a supply disruption in a trend-driven market. You don't just lose the sale, you lose the customer. The kid who buys an Ibanez because the Kramer wasn't in stock doesn't come back 6 months later when the Kramer finally arrives. He's already bonded with the Ibanez. He's already learning songs on it. He's already showing it to his friends. Kramer didn't just lose units, it lost momentum. And in a business built almost entirely on momentum, and that was the most expensive thing it could lose. And here's what made the supply disruption so damaging. It arrived at the exact moment Kramer could least afford it. The company was spending heavily. Endorsement deals with major artists carried real costs. Not just free guitars, but royalties, advertising commitments, co-branded marketing campaigns, promotional appearances, and the care and feeding of relationships with musicians who expected to be treated like the stars they were. The Floyd Rose arrangement, which had been Kramer's greatest competitive advantage, also carried ongoing royalty obligations. Every Floyd Rose-equipped guitar that left Neptune generated a payment owed to Floyd Rose. When sales were high and cash was flowing, those royalties were the cost of dominance. When supply chains stuttered and deliveries slipped, the royalties didn't pause. They kept accumulating against a revenue line that was shrinking. Dennis Berardi was still running the operation. Andrew Papicchio was still managing the day-to-day manufacturing and logistics. The company was still famous. The endorsement roster was still stacked with names that MTV viewers recognized. But underneath the visible brand, the financial architecture was tightening in ways that fame couldn't fix. Revenue depended on guitars reaching dealers. Guitars reaching dealers depended on parts arriving from Asia. Parts arriving from Asia depended on conditions that Kramer couldn't influence, couldn't predict, and hadn't built a contingency for. A company that had risen by moving faster than its competitors was now discovering the cost of speed without structure. The reasonable response, the textbook response, would have been to retrench, cut the endorsement spending, renegotiate the royalty terms, diversify the supply base, build a financial cushion for the next disruption, shore up the foundation before the next storm. They didn't retrench, they kept spending. The logic, if you were inside it, probably felt obvious. You don't cut your artist roster when your brand depends on artist visibility. You don't reduce advertising when your competitors are increasing theirs. You don't signal weakness in a market that rewards confidence. Every reason to keep spending made sense in isolation. Together, they guaranteed that when the next blow landed, there would be nothing left to absorb it. The clouds weren't gathering on the horizon anymore. They were overhead. Every collapse has a logic. Not the logic of malice or incompetence, though both can play their parts, but the logic of reasonable people making defensible choices that, strung together in sequence, produce a catastrophe none of them intended. Kramer's unraveling wasn't one bad decision. It was 4, and each one made the next one worse. The first decision was the oldest. Move away from full domestic production. Source components offshore. Let Japanese factories handle the wood while Neptune handled the identity. Dennis Berardi and Peter LaPlaca made that call in 1981, and it's hard to argue they were wrong. Aluminum necks were expensive and niche. Wooden necks were what the market wanted. Japanese manufacturers could produce them at quality and cost levels Neptune couldn't match. The math was clean. The strategy was sound. Every American instrument company that survived the 1980s made some version of the same calculation. Kramer wasn't being reckless. It was being rational, but rationality has a cumulative cost. Each year the balance shifted a little further. By 1983, Neptune was assembling more than it was manufacturing. By 1985, the Japanese supply relationship wasn't a supplement. It was the spine. By 1987, the American series guitars were Japanese-made necks and Japanese-made bodies, finished and assembled in New Jersey. The factory hadn't been hollowed out in one dramatic act. It had been thinned, gradually, by the same efficiency logic that had made the company successful, and with each incremental shift, Neptune's ability to respond to a disruption, to build its own necks, to source its own wood, to function as an independent manufacturing operation, diminished. Andrew Papicchio, working the operations side, was living inside that dependency every day. When the parts arrived on time, the system hummed. When they didn't, there was nothing to do but wait. A factory that can't make its own core components is a factory at the mercy of someone else's calendar. The second decision was the one that made Kramer famous. Tie the brand's identity to Eddie Van Halen, the Floyd Rose tremolo, and the superstrat formula. Again, this wasn't foolish. It was brilliant. Eddie Van Halen's endorsement didn't just increase sales. It created a category. The Kramer superstrat became the default instrument of an entire genre, and the Floyd Rose became the hardware that defined that instrument's capability. Paul Unkert built the guitars. Dennis Berardi managed the relationship. The results were spectacular. Guitars selling as fast as retailers could stock them, a brand recognition that rivaled companies with 50 years of history, and a cultural position that made Kramer synonymous with the sound of the decade. The problem wasn't the strategy. The problem was the narrowness. Kramer's identity was the superstrat, the pointy headstock, the Floyd Rose, the hair metal aesthetic. That identity sold phenomenally well to a specific audience at a specific moment. It did not sell to jazz players. It did not sell to blues players. It did not sell to country players. It did not sell to the growing population of guitarists who were beginning to listen to REM, the Smiths, U2, bands whose sound had nothing to do with dive bombs and hot pink graphics. The brand had bet everything on one corner of the market, and as long as that corner was the biggest room in the building, the bet paid off. The question was what happened when the room got smaller, and the room was about to get smaller. Grunge was still a few years away, but the cultural shift was already stirring by the late 1980s. The flashy excess of mid-decade hard rock was beginning to feel like a costume rather than a movement. Players who'd grown up on Van Halen were starting to listen to different things. The aesthetic that had made Kramer king, the speed, the flash, the technical pyrotechnics, was slowly becoming the thing the next wave of musicians would define themselves against. Kurt Cobain wouldn't play a superstrat. He'd play a beat-up Fender, and that choice would be a statement as loud as anything Eddie Van Halen ever played. Kramer didn't pivot. Kramer kept building superstrats. The third decision was the one that bled them. Keep feeding the endorsement and advertising machine, even after the supply stress started showing. Dennis Berardi understood the music industry as a celebrity business. Endorsements weren't decoration. They were distribution. A Kramer in Richie Sambora's hands on MTV was worth more than 100 print ads. The logic was real, and through the mid-1980s, it had been validated spectacularly. But endorsement deals cost money. Not just the guitars, those were relatively cheap. The real costs were the royalties, the advertising commitments, the promotional budgets, the artist relations infrastructure, the constant spending required to keep the machine visible and loud. By 1989, the spending had crossed the line. Berardi had launched a sister venture, Berardi/Thomas Entertainment, and the company's resources were being stretched across endorsement obligations that had been designed for a boom that was no longer booming at the same volume. The deals signed during the peak years carried fixed costs. The revenue those deals were supposed to generate was softening. The gap between obligation and income was widening, and the company's response was not to cut, but to keep spending. Because cutting endorsements in a celebrity driven market felt like announcing your own decline. It was a trap built from success. Every endorsement deal that had worked brilliantly in 1985 was now a financial commitment in 1989. And the market that had justified those commitments was cooling. The instruments were still good, the players were still famous, but the river of cash that had made the whole system feel effortless was running lower, and the company was still drawing from it at peak year rates. There's a particular kind of corporate denial that afflicts companies built on cultural trends. The executives inside those companies can feel the temperature changing. They read the same magazines, they watch the same television, they see the new bands getting attention, but they can't bring themselves to act on it, because acting on it means admitting that the thing they built, the thing that made them successful, the thing that defined their identity is passing. Kramer's leadership wasn't blind to the shifts in the market. They were bound to them. And the brand was the superstrat. The business model was the endorsement machine. Changing either one meant becoming a different company, and nobody starts a revolution against their own success. The fourth decision, or rather the fourth failure, was the one that cut the artery. Let the Floyd Rose royalty problem metastasize. The Floyd Rose tremolo had been Kramer's single greatest competitive advantage. Stock Floyd Rose hardware, offered on production guitars when no other major brand could match it. That exclusivity had driven sales, defined the brand's identity, and given every Kramer Superstrat a feature that justified its price. It had also generated royalty obligations on every single unit sold. As cash tightened, Kramer fell behind on those royalties, not all at once, gradually. The way a company under financial pressure falls behind on anything. A payment delayed here, a negotiation extended there, a promise to catch up next quarter. But Floyd Rose wasn't a patient creditor with an emotional attachment to the partnership. Floyd Rose was a business, and the business of licensing tremolo hardware depended on getting paid. The exclusive distribution agreement, the arrangement that had made Kramer the only game in town for stock Floyd Rose, ended in January 1991. Fender took over distribution. The hardware that had been Kramer's moat was now available to Kramer's biggest competitor. In one contractual shift, the competitive advantage that had helped build the empire was gone. Not stolen, forfeited. Lost through the slow accumulation of unpaid obligations that the company had let compound while it kept spending on everything else. 4 decisions: offshore dependence, brand narrowness, endorsement overspending, royalty default, each one reasonable in isolation, each one survivable on its own. Together in sequence, they were fatal. The structure that had looked so impressive from the outside, the number one brand, the celebrity roster, the Neptune address, was built on supply chains it didn't control, revenue streams that were narrowing, cost obligations that were fixed, and a hardware relationship that was deteriorating from the inside. By the time the market turned, by the time grunge arrived and the superstrat era began its unmistakable retreat, Kramer had no reserves, no diversification, no fallback position. The company that had learned to sell the 1980s faster than anyone else had never learned how to survive anything other than the 1980s. It didn't take decades. It didn't take a slow municipal unwinding, the way steel towns and auto cities experienced their losses. Layoff by layoff, year by year, generation watching generation leave. Kramer's collapse compressed the entire arc into months. What Bethlehem Steel took 30 years to lose, Kramer lost in fewer than 5. By 1990, the company was hemorrhaging. The endorsement costs hadn't stopped. The supply disruptions hadn't healed. The Floyd Rose relationship was in its final deterioration. The Korean pipeline was unreliable. The Japanese components were still arriving, but into a factory whose ability to move finished product was shrinking faster than its ability to assemble it. In the market, the hair metal market that had been Kramer's entire world, was shifting under their feet. Warrant and Poison were still selling records, but the energy had moved. The guitar magazines that had once been wall-to-wall superstrats were starting to feature different shapes, different sounds, different players. The kids walking into guitar shops weren't all reaching for the pointy headstock anymore. Some of them were reaching for Strats and Les Pauls and Telecasters, the vintage shapes that the next era of rock would embrace as a repudiation of everything the 1980s had stood for. The factory in Neptune didn't wind down gracefully. There was no staged transition, no planned reduction, no orderly handoff to a successor operation. The original Kramer Company simply ran out of road. In January 1991, the exclusive Floyd Rose distribution agreement officially ended. Fender now had access to the same hardware that had defined Kramer's identity for nearly a decade. The moat was gone. The guitars stopped shipping. The dealers stopped calling. The paychecks stopped coming. What happened next has the feel of a story that nobody wanted to tell and nobody wanted to remember. The company that had outsold Fender and Gibson, the company that had put guitars in the hands of Eddie Van Halen and Richie Sambora and Vivian Campbell, the company whose name had been stamped on more American electric guitars than any other brand for 2 consecutive years, held a fire sale out of New Jersey. Surplus parts, leftover necks, unfinished bodies, hardware still in bins, Floyd Rose tremolos that would never be installed in a production guitar, tuners, Eddie pickguards, bridge studs, the remnants of a production operation that had, only a few years earlier, been the center of the guitar world, sold off in bulk to whoever showed up with cash. Dealers came, parts brokers came, opportunists came. They picked through the remains of what had been the #1 guitar brand in America the way people pick through a yard sale, looking for bargains, not paying respects. There was no ceremony, no last guitar rolling off the line with a plaque and a photograph. No final shift where workers signed the last instrument and shook hands in the parking lot. The public record doesn't give us that scene, and the absence itself tells you something about how this ended. Not every factory gets a cinematic goodbye. Some get a liquidation. Some just stop. And the stopping is so fast and so unglamorous that nobody thinks to document it. The cameras that had filmed MTV-era Kramers in the hands of rock gods on arena stages were not present for the fire sale in New Jersey. Nobody was filming the bins of surplus necks. The Neptune building, which had hummed with spray compressors and soldering irons and the sharp chemical smell of fresh lacquer, went quiet. Not the gradual quieting of a factory winding down over months. A line shut here, a shift reduced there, the volume slowly dropping like a song fading out. This was abrupt. The assembly stations where Floyd Rose tremolos had been fitted into thousands of routed bodies sat empty. The spray booths where Dennis Klein's graphics had been sealed under layers of clear coat stood dark. And the shipping area where boxed guitars had been stacked for transport to dealers across America had nothing left to ship. The speed of it was the cruelest part. 5 years. From #1 to nothing in 5 years. Bethlehem Steel took decades to die. The auto plants in Detroit closed in waves that stretched across generations. The textile mills of New England wound down over half a century. Kramer went from the summit to the fire sale in less time than a high school kid takes to graduate. A freshman who'd saved up for a Kramer Beretta could have been a senior before the company that made it ceased to exist. Dennis Berardi, the man who'd walked onto that plane to Anaheim and walked off with an introduction to Eddie Van Halen, the man who'd built a retail instinct into a national brand. The man who'd understood the celebrity guitar market better than anyone in the industry. Dennis Berardi watched the company he'd operated for over a decade come apart in his hands. The workers who'd fitted necks and dressed frets and sprayed finishes and boxed guitars, their names for the most part aren't in the public record. The oral histories of the Neptune floor haven't been collected the way that steelworker memoirs fill library shelves in Bethlehem and Youngstown. Guitar factories don't generate the same institutional memory as steel mills or auto plants. The workforce was smaller. The community footprint was lighter. The loss was real, but it was compact, measured in dozens of livelihoods rather than thousands. That doesn't make it smaller to the people who lived it. It just makes it quieter. And quieter losses are the ones that disappear first, because nobody builds a memorial to a guitar factory the way they build one to a steel mill. What remains of the collapse is not a ruin in the traditional sense. No rusted beams, no broken windows open to the rain, just an absence, a gap in the record where a company used to be, filled now with surplus parts stories and eBay listings and the fading recollections of people who were there when the spray booths were running and who left when they weren't. The brand didn't die with the factory. Brand names rarely do. They get sold, shelved, revived, licensed, passed from owner to owner like a title deed separated from the land it once described. The name, Kramer, was worth something even after everything the name had been attached to was gone. Henry Vaccaro, the original investor. The man who'd put money into the aluminum neck dream back in the late 1970s held on to the Kramer brand. By 1995, he attempted one last run. Working from Neptune, using surplus parts that still remained from the original operation, Vaccaro tried to produce Kramer guitars again. A few hundred instruments were built, not a few thousand, not the volume that had once made the name dominant. A few hundred assembled from the leftover bones of a company that had already been dead for 4 years. It was a haunting exercise. The same address, some of the same parts, none of the same momentum. A brand that had been synonymous with excess and celebrity and the loudest decade in rock and roll history, reduced to a small batch afterlife powered by surplus inventory. The guitars Vaccaro built were functional instruments. They were real Kramers. As in the narrowest material sense, made from Kramer parts, assembled in what had been a Kramer facility. But the thing that had made a Kramer, the cultural velocity, the MTV visibility, the Eddie Van Halen command signal, the feeling that buying one put you inside something bigger than a guitar purchase. That was gone. You can't assemble that from leftover necks and surplus Floyd Rose studs. You can only assemble a guitar. And a guitar without the mythology is just wood and wire. In 1997, Gibson purchased the Kramer brand out of bankruptcy. The name left Neptune for good. It would resurface periodically on reissue instruments and budget lines, a ghost of the 1980s licensed to haunt the catalogs of a much larger company. Gibson would occasionally produce Kramers that nodded to the classic designs, the Beretta silhouette, the pointy headstock, the bright colors. But these were echoes, not continuations. The factory that had given the instruments their identity was closed. The people who had built them were gone. What remained was a trademark and a set of visual cues that could be applied to guitars made anywhere in the world by anyone Gibson chose to contract. The brand had become pure abstraction, detached from the place and the people who'd made it mean something. And the building stayed. The former Kramer facility at 685 Neptune Boulevard didn't become a museum. It didn't become a landmark on a guitar history walking tour. It didn't become a rehearsal space or a recording studio or any of the things that might have preserved some connection between the address and its past. Current public listings for the property show businesses like Stone Mandia and JSAS Healthcare, commercial tenants, office suites, healthcare services. The kind of occupants that fill a building after its original purpose has been forgotten by everyone except the people who lived through it. Walk past it today, and you'd see what you'd see on any commercial stretch of any New Jersey boulevard. A low-slung building in an ordinary lot, doing ordinary business. The parking spaces where workers once pulled in for the morning assembly shift now serve people arriving for appointments and meetings that have nothing to do with guitars, nothing to do with Floyd Rose tremolos, nothing to do with the moment in the mid-1980s when a compact factory in Monmouth County was the beating heart of an entire musical genre. There's no residue of what happened here, no lingering smell of lacquer in the hallways, no ghostly hum of spray compressors in the walls, just a building doing what buildings do after their stories end, housing the next thing and the thing after that, until nobody who enters it knows what it used to be. The superstrat era left behind guitars, thousands of them scattered across attics and pawn shops and collector walls and eBay listings and climate-controlled display cases. A 1985 Kramer Beretta in good condition with an original Floyd Rose and a single Seymour Duncan humbucker sells for serious money now. Collectors want them. Players want them. The instruments have outlived the company that made them, which is a kind of immortality, though not the kind Dennis Berardi was building toward when he shook hands with Eddie Van Halen's tour manager on a flight to Anaheim. He was building a company. What survived was the product. The company is a Wikipedia entry and a licensing agreement. The product is in somebody's hands right now, still in tune, still fast, still carrying the ghost of what Neptune used to mean. Kramer mattered. That's the thing worth saying plainly, before the story folds shut. It mattered because a small group of people in Neptune, New Jersey figured out how to turn a niche instrument company into the fastest, loudest brand in American guitar. They didn't do it with heritage. They didn't do it with tradition. They didn't do it with the accumulated credibility of decades in the business. They did it with speed, song with instinct, with a willingness to build exactly what the moment demanded and ship it before the moment passed. The aluminum necks were real innovation. The offshore pivot was real strategy. The Eddie Van Halen partnership was real vision. The Floyd Rose exclusivity was a real competitive advantage that no rival could match for years. The factory floor, where workers fitted bridges and sprayed custom graphics and dressed frets to the tolerances that professional players required, where Paul Unkert built instruments for the most famous guitarist in the world, where Dennis Klein's wild artwork was sealed under clear coat and sent into the hands of a generation. That was real craftsmanship, applied at real scale, in service of something that felt, for a few incandescent years, like the future of the electric guitar. The failure was structural, not moral. Nobody in Neptune set out to destroy what they'd built. They set out to ride it, and they rode it with a confidence that left no room for the possibility that the ride might end. The offshore dependence that made growth possible also made disruption fatal. The endorsement spending that built the brand also drained it. The Floyd Rose exclusivity that created the moat also created the obligation that, when unpaid, handed the moat to a competitor. Every strength became a vulnerability, and every vulnerability activated at once. What do you lose when a place like that goes quiet? Not just the jobs, though the jobs mattered to every person who held one. Not just the brand, though the brand had real weight in the world. You lose the proof that it happened at all. You lose the physical evidence that a building on a New Jersey boulevard was once the place where a generation's idea of what a guitar should look and sound and feel like was assembled, finished, and shipped into the world. The guitars survive in collections and cases and on stages where players still reach for that particular feel. The building survives, repurposed and unremarkable. The connection between them, the living fact that this building made those guitars, is severed.